The day the world ended for me began not with a bang or a whimper, but with a flat, sickening thud of a falling crate. I was on the third-floor balcony of the university's physics department, leaning against the cold iron railing. A weak winter sun did little to combat the February chill that seeped through my tweed jacket. Beside me, Dr. Lena Petrova, our department's brilliant and brutally pragmatic experimentalist, nursed a steaming mug of tea, her brow furrowed as she stared into the middle distance. On my other side, Kenji Tanaka, a postdoc whose youthful enthusiasm hadn't yet been ground down by the relentless cynicism of academia, was excitedly explaining a new data compression algorithm. So, the entanglement-assisted protocol could theoretically reduce the signal noise by an order of magnitude, which means crack, thump. The sound was shockingly final. It sliced through the ambient noise of the campus, the distant chatter of students, the rustle of wind in the bare-branched oaks. We all flinched. Below us, in the service courtyard, a large wooden shipping crate lay shattered on the cobblestones. It had fallen from a winch being used for renovations on the roof, and right where it landed, a flash of ginger fur had been tumbling only a moment before, one of the stray cats that haunted the university grounds, a playful creature we'd all taken to feeding. Workers in hard hats rushed from the building, their shouts echoing in the enclosed space. "My God," Lena breathed, her mug frozen halfway to her lips. "That poor thing." They gathered around the wreckage. We couldn't see the cat, only the splintered wood and the grim, urgent posture of the men. One of them produced a heavy canvas tarp, and with a shared, somber glance, they carefully covered the entire area. The finality of the gesture was absolute. "There's no way it survived that," Lena stated, her voice flat with certainty. She was a woman who dealt in definite outcomes, in measurements and results. For her, the system had been observed, the conclusion foregone. "You don't know that," Kenji countered, his voice small. "Maybe it darted away just in time. Cats are fast. It could be hiding, terrified." "Kenji, a quarter-ton of solid oak just occupied the exact same coordinates it did," Lena said, her tone devoid of malice, simply stating a fact. A cold, familiar thought unspooled in my mind. "Functionally zero isn't zero," I said, my voice quiet. They both turned to look at me. "Right now, under that top, in that box of uncertainty you've both created, the cat exists in a superposition of states. It is both alive and dead." Lena sighed, a puff of white in the cold air. "Aldous, please, don't start with the thought experiments. It was a cat, not a quantum particle." "But isn't that the point of Schrödinger's paradox?" I pressed, leaning forward, the cold of the railing forgotten. "He invented it to show the absurdity of applying quantum rules to the macroscopic world. He put a hypothetical cat in a box with a vial of poison linked to a radioactive atom. If the atom decays, a quantum event, a 50-50 chance, the poison is released and the cat dies. Until you open the box and observe the system, the atom is both decayed and not decayed. Therefore, the cat is both dead and alive." "A quantum ghost," Kenji murmured. "Exactly," I said. "A blur of possibilities. And our observation, the act of looking, is what forces the universe to choose. It collapses the wave function from a state of dead and alive to a single reality, either dead or alive." "It's a philosophical cudgel, Aldous, not a physical reality," Lena insisted, though her eyes were malfixed on the top below. "Decoherence, the sheer number of environmental interactions, air molecules, thermal radiation, the gravity of the damn planet, forces a macroscopic object like a cat into a definite state almost instantaneously. We don't see cats in a superposition because the universe is constantly observing them. She was, of course, correct. That was the textbook answer. That was the firewall that kept the madness of the quantum realm safely locked away from our solid, predictable world. But as I stared at that canvas shroud, I felt a tremor of profound unease. The workers were walking away now, leaving the grim tableau for the campus groundkeeper to deal with. The cat's fate remained sealed, unknown, a private, morbid little superposition in the heart of the university. "What if the firewall is breaking down, Lena?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You've been spending too much time with your equations, Aldous. You need to get some sleep. The world isn't a thought experiment." But she was wrong. That's precisely what it had become, and the events of the past year were the horrifying proof. The little tragedy in the courtyard was just a symbol, a miniature echo of the grand, terrifying uncertainty that had seeped into the very bedrock of our existence. That cat was our world, trapped under a tarp of impossibility, and none of us dared to look for fear of what we might find. They say the world changed slowly at first, a subtle thaw, like glaciers yielding imperceptibly to a warming sun. But I saw it differently. For those of us who had dedicated our lives to charting the strange, shimmering architecture beneath reality, it felt more like watching a wave function collapse. A sudden, definitive shift from a universe of possibilities to a stark, unsettling actuality. One moment, the system is a blur of potential. The next, a single, undeniable outcome asserts itself. That was how our world, the solid, predictable world, began to unravel. It began with the crimes. Or perhaps it was merely when we, the oblivious inhabitants of a clockwork cosmos, first started to notice the gears slipping. These were not the transgressions of passion, greed, or desperation that filled the usual police blotters and news feeds. These were different, impossibilities made manifest, aberrations that tore at the very fabric of cause and effect. They were random, yet chillingly precise, violent in their implications, yet often leaving no trace, no discernible method, only an echoing void where logic should have been. Consider the man in Berlin, a mid-level accountant named Herr Müller, found drowned in his meticulously locked fourth-floor apartment, miles from any significant body of water. His lungs were filled with salt water, the coroner's report stated with clinical bewilderment, teeming with diatoms specific to the North Atlantic. The doors were bolted from the inside, windows sealed. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, just Müller, lifeless on his Persian rug, his expression one of profound surprise, as if the ocean itself had materialized around him for a fatal instant. Investigators spoke of elaborate, undetectable suicide methods, but their voices lacked conviction. Then there was the museum heist in Kyoto, executed in the brilliant glare of midday. The target, the legendary Whispering Jade, a Neolithic pendant of exquisite craftsmanship, housed within a triple-layered, pressure-sensitive, laser-grid-protected vitrine. Security footage showed the hallways, during and after the alleged theft, empty, silent, not a flicker of a shadow, not a single intruder. Yet the pendant vanished. The case remained sealed, alarms untriggered. It was as if the jade, weary of its confinement, had simply decided to be elsewhere, tunneling through its barriers like a subatomic particle breaching an energy well it theoretically couldn't surmount. The official explanation hinted at an inside job of almost supernatural skill, but the museum director, a man of quiet dignity, later confessed to a journalist, off the record, that it felt like a theft by a ghost, or by mathematics itself. A child in a quiet suburban home in Toronto, a boy of 7 named Leo, gave a tearful, unwavering account of his father disappearing like smoke. One moment, his father was reading him a bedtime story, his warm voice a familiar comfort. The next, he simply thinned, became translucent, and then was gone. The police, treating it as a potential kidnapping or a runaway spouse, found no evidence of foul play, no indication the man had packed a bag or even walked out the door. His car was in the garage, his wallet on the nightstand. Beyond one terrified boy's unwavering memory and a faint, unidentifiable scent of ozone in the room, it was as if the man had never existed. His disappearance was an erasure, a clean excision from the narrative of their lives. These incidents, initially dismissed as isolated anomalies, began to form a disturbing constellation. A renowned violinist in Prague found her priceless Stradivarius replaced overnight with a perfect but utterly silent replica made of common wood, despite the instrument never leaving its bank vault. A research submarine exploring the Mariana Trench surfaced to find its interior hull inexplicably coated with a thin layer of Saharan sand, its crew suffering from acute dehydration, though their mission logs and oxygen supplies indicated a normal dive. The world's media, hungry for sensation, offered a buffet of explanations. Sophisticated new technologies wielded by unknown syndicates, mass hysteria, even extraterrestrial intervention. But for those of us familiar with the quantum realm, another, more disturbing pattern was emerging. The common denominator was an absence of classical logic, an absence of discernible reason, an absence of cause leading to effect. In its place was a chilling sense of probability made manifest, as if the universe had begun to idly shuffle through its deck of potential realities, dealing out a few wild cards onto the macroscopic table. People, understandably, sought refuge in older explanations. They talked about black magic returning to the world, their voices hushed in online forums. They whispered in mosques and churches about jinn, demons, or ancient capricious forces stirring from a long slumber. The very air seemed to change, not in any way our instruments could measure. Humidity, pressure, temperature, all remained stubbornly normal, yet people felt it. A subtle, crackling tension, an unnameable anticipation, like a violin string stretched impossibly tight across the sky, humming with a note just beyond human hearing. Anxiety became a baseline state. I, Dr. Aldous Quentin, kept to my cluttered university lab, to the chalkboards I scrawled upon with a manic energy, to the thought experiments I whispered only to myself in the sterile silence of the late hours, because the thoughts that arose in my mind, quiet, insistent, utterly impossible thoughts, were dangerous. They felt like forbidden knowledge, the kind that once glimpsed could never be unseen. I am a theoretical quantum physicist. My academic journey had taken me from the hollowed halls of Cambridge, through postdoctoral studies in Copenhagen under the intellectual descendants of Bohr, to a challenging stint at CERN, and then to that brief, intense and, in retrospect, pivotal period at the Institute for Macroscopic Quantum Coherence, in the remote, snowbound landscapes of northern Finland. It was there, amidst the silent forests and the ethereal dance of the aurora borealis, that everything, unknowingly, began to shift. Quantum mechanics, despite its ubiquity in modern technology, is not what most people imagine. It is not merely a more sophisticated set of tools. It is, at its heart, a philosophy encoded in the language of probability, a profoundly unsettling way of describing a world that stubbornly refuses to obey our deepest intuitions. As the brilliant Richard Feynman, a man who breathed quantum equations, once conceded with characteristic bluntness, I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. He wasn't being falsely modest. He was stating a fundamental truth about the chasm between its predictive power and our intuitive grasp. The double-slit experiment remains the single most paradigm-shattering observation humanity has ever made. Shine a beam of electrons, indisputable particles, through a barrier with two slits, and you expect two bands on a detector screen. Instead, you get an interference pattern, as though the electrons were waves passing through both slits simultaneously. But attempt to observe which slit each electron passes through, and the interference pattern vanishes. The electrons, as if self-conscious, revert to behaving like particles. The act of observation, of acquiring information, fundamentally alters the outcome. It's as if reality holds its breath until we look. Einstein, for all his revolutionary insights, recoiled from this. God does not play dice, he famously quipped, a statement of profound unease with a universe that seemed to operate on chance rather than immutable law. Yet the evidence piled up inexorably. Bell's theorem, quantum entanglement, Einstein's spooky action at a distance, superposition, it all pointed towards one terrifying, exhilarating conclusion. At its most fundamental level, the universe is probabilistic. Things do not happen because they must, but because they might, and that might is governed by the elegant, wave-like mathematics of quantum theory. That was the accepted wisdom, a strange set of rules for a subatomic game, safely cordoned off from our everyday world by the seemingly insurmountable barrier of decoherence. Until, very suddenly, it wasn't. The barrier, it seemed, had become porous, or perhaps it had shattered entirely. I remember the precise moment the first sliver of true, bone-chilling suspicion pierced through my academic detachment. I had been idly scanning international news digests when I came across a series of perplexing reports from Riyadh. Men and women from various walks of life vanishing without a trace from secure locations. The Saudi authorities were publicly baffled. Their official internal designation for these events, leaked by a disgruntled civil servant, was localized anomalous vanishings, a sterile phrase designed to contain an uncontainable fear. But I knew, or rather, I felt a sickening lurch of recognition. I recognized the pattern, or more accurately, the utter lack of any classical pattern. It reminded me, with an unwelcome jolt, of quantum tunneling, that peculiar phenomenon where a particle, constrained by an energy barrier it should not be able to overcome, simply appears on the other side. Its wave function, representing the probability of its location, has a tiny, non-zero value on the other side of the barrier. And if you make a measurement, there's a chance you'll find it there. What if, and the thought was a cold dread seeping into my veins, this wasn't confined to particles anymore? What if the probability curves were flattening for macroscopic objects, for people? The very idea was heretical, but something had undeniably changed. My mind kept returning to Finland, to those long dark winters and the humming machinery in the sub-basement labs of the Institute, to my colleague, the brilliant but reckless Dr. Aris Thorne. We had been experimenting with creating macroscopic quantum coherence fields, attempting to make billions of particles behave as one single quantum entity. It was theoretical groundwork.
"What if we scale the system further, Aldous?" Eris had mused late one night, illuminated by the glow of a monitor displaying a cascade of equations. His eyes held a fanatical gleam. Forget entangling particles in a condensate. What if we entangle the entanglers? Create a resonance field that encompasses, well, everything. What if we're not just observing the universe? What if we're tuning it? We had laughed, a nervous sound in the stillness, a thought experiment, but I see now that for Eris it was a business plan, a mission statement. What if someone, somewhere, perhaps Thorne himself, hadn't stopped? What if he had found a way to apply the unsettling mechanics of uncertainty and superposition to the human scale? Could that explain the inexplicable case in Paris just a few months prior? A prominent arms negotiator found dead in his hotel suite, locked from the inside. Toxicology reports found a lethal dose of a rare arsenic compound in his bloodstream. Yet his personal, hermetically sealed flask of mineral water, the only potential source, tested clean. It was as if the arsenic had materialized directly within his circulatory system, having tunneled in from a parallel probability, a version of reality where the flask had been lethally tampered with, only for that aspect to collapse into our timeline, leaving the physical flask untouched. Of course, I couldn't articulate these suspicions publicly. I would be dismissed as a crank, ridiculed by my peers. Or worse, I'd be quietly taken away by the same reality-bending forces that had made the diplomat meet his impossible end. The people around me were already fraying. Seasoned journalists penned articles about the occult. Grave-faced politicians blamed shadowy cults. Religious leaders declared the apocalypse had begun.
Whispers had begun to circulate on encrypted academic forums, fragmented observations from other physicists and mathematicians, all pointing to anomalies that defied classical explanation. A new name for our fracturing world began to circulate, whispered at first, then adopted with a kind of grim, ironic acceptance. I don't know who coined the term Quantamund, perhaps a mathematician at MIT, but it felt chillingly accurate. A portmanteau of quanta and the Latin mundus for world. The term, with its somber classical weight, felt chillingly accurate and was quickly adopted, not as a joke, but as a sobering diagnosis of our encroaching reality. Quantamund, a world where the probabilistic laws of the quantum realm were no longer confined to the infinitesimal, but were visibly, tangibly, and often catastrophically rewriting the rules of everyday life. A world where you might, if the odds were infinitesimally in your favor, find yourself walking through a solid wall, where concepts like guilt and innocence became terrifyingly fluid. The strange events, the impossible crimes, the growing sense of a world unmoored from its own laws, these were not random glitches in the matrix. I see that now. They were tests, calibrations, the first tentative notes of a symphony being tuned before the terrible crescendo. The scattered anomalies that so terrified the world were merely the tremors before the earthquake. They were the overture. But none of us, not even I, with my deepest, most paranoid suspicions about Aris and his ambitions, could have predicted the sheer, brutal finality of what came next. None of us were prepared for the Trinity Tragedy.